Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Davila, and I'm coming to you live from the Makati Shangri-La Hotel. This is the World Economic Forum on East Asia, and we are hosting right now the sessions. This is the first televised session of the first day of the World Economic Forum. Is the Philippines the next Asian miracle? This couldn't have come at a more auspicious time, with the Philippines experiencing a 7.2% growth rate in the last year, three international credit rating agencies putting the country's credit ratings notches up, the stock market beating its own record high 71 times since 2010. The country has a better debt position. The question is this all sustainable? Can the country keep on, specifically with the ASEAN integration happening in 2015? And this session will be televised in English. It'll also be translated into Japanese and Chinese. My panelists this morning, I'd like to start with the Secretary of Tourism in the Philippines. Secretary Ramon Jimenez Jr. will be talking about soft power as part of the economy. We have with us Kevin Liu. He was the former head of the private arm of the World Bank, distinguished fellow of ANSIAD, young global leader and Global Agenda Council on China. We have with us Manuel Pangilinan. He is the chairman of the PLDT, or Philippine Long Distance Telephone Company from the Philippines. Karim Razlan is the Group Chief Executive Officer of the KRA Group of Malaysia, Global Agenda Council on Southeast Asia. And we have with us as well Marife Zamora. She's the chairman of the Convergys Corporation, the largest BPO in the country. And the youngest panelist joining us this morning is Cherry Ateliano. She'll be talking about inclusive growth, especially with agriculture. She's the co-founder and president of the social entrepreneur of Gawad Kalinga. Good morning to all of you, and later on, the audience will also be asking questions to our panelists. We have some experts in the audience as well. So I'd like to start first from the point of view of the outsiders. How do you see the Philippines in terms not just of numbers, but in terms of genuine growth? Kevin.
Yeah, I think, Karen, as you mentioned, as we just see in that introduction video as well, we do have a very positive momentum here for the Philippines over the last, I would say, 2 to 4 years. And you see a number of sort of incremental improvements in terms of the perception of the economy, in terms of how the country is positioned, in terms of trade and other flows. So I think that's my first point. I think the positive thing is widely shared, right? It's not a view by the minorities. But I would say the second point, especially from a foreign investment perspective, as Karen mentioned, I used to run the World Bank's sort of private investment guarantee business, particularly look at the perception of risk. I think there is still a fairly strong sense by the foreign investors that there is regulatory uncertainty, there is policy actions which they may or may not be able to predict. So I think those perception of risk, those perception of uncertainty is still a hurdle, because as we can see from the Asia experience, right, there are many economies have gone through this particular development stage. FDI and other foreign flows typically play a very important role. My last point I would mention, Karen, in my sort of first intervention is that, again, if you look at the experience in Asia, whether it's the Tigers several decades ago, or the Chinas or the other countries, in terms of development, when we talk about a miracle, if we want something that is significantly improving people's lives and really push the country forward, you need a long, sustained period of growth. I think a couple of years of good years are very good, but that's not enough. So I think one of the key challenges is how do we make sure things are sustained, and what does the government have to do, and what does the private sector have to do, and what type of perceptions we need to create internationally for Philippines to have a long 10, 15, 20 years of very sustained growth. That's the only way when you have that compounding effect to really take the country from here to the next level.
All right, these are very good points, Kevin. Let me take you first to Karim. I'm choosing to get the perspectives of the outsiders first. Okay, now Karim, foreign direct investments in the Philippines have increased 20% last year, but compared to our Asian neighbors, the numbers aren't as high with FDIs.
Well, clearly, I mean, I think I've got a lot of friends who are looking, or they bought assets here, and generally they do find the Filipino market is quite tricksy. That's always a line that comes. It's quite tricksy, more difficult than Indonesia, to be frank, and that's something that has to be borne in mind because, of course, the size of the market is that much smaller, and if it's that much more tricksy, that's important to note. The other thing is I'm also a columnist, so one thing I must stress, which I think for those who are in the media looking on in Philippines, is the consistency of leadership here since President Aquino has been in. I remember interviewing him in 2010, and to be frank, there was a charisma deficit. He was quite dull. But
What was that? Okay, that just like got me.
No. But how impressive the man has been in delivering.
All right.
And I think this is the point that has to be made. This is a man I remember saying, we are going to do this. Good governance. We are going to increase tourism. We are going to increase this, that, and the other. And then in 2014, I remember listening to him in Kuala Lumpur, and by God, he's done it. So I think what you've got here is a man who's just delivered, and that impresses the markets, and that impresses investors, and that impresses the hell out of people such as myself, you know. Very low-key, but it's done. However, more has to be put into education and healthcare here. Definitely in terms of infrastructure. I think that still needs a lot more in terms of public-private partnership and everything. But the potential, and I feel this is the most important thing, since you are here, sir, tourism, is how wonderful this archipelago is. I've traveled quite extensively over it, Bohol and all these places. I actually interviewed the president when he was on the campaign train in Tacloban, and a remarkable place. This is something which is still not sufficiently known outside the Philippines. The islands are beautiful, the water is beautiful. You still need to push that more.
Okay, now let's talk about the key drivers of growth, since Kevin and Kareem have brought up their perspective on how the outsiders see the Philippines. I'd like to start first with Manny Pangilinan, who is a businessman in the country. Have you experienced and described the growth drivers you've seen in the last few years that made us have these numbers of 7.2%?
Well, I think first, just to extend the point made by Kevin, there's no reason why the Philippines cannot sustain the growth levels we've seen for the past, say, 3 or 4 years. No? But to really drive the economy on a sustained basis, I think the common view of economists is that the economy must grow by a minimum of 6% for about 8 to 10 years. No? So we're sort of halfway there, 3, 4 years of growth. But I think the concerns are well known. It's a well trodden ground.
What are the concerns?
Well, infrastructure, power will be a constraint on growth, agriculture, and at the end of the day, the rising inequality of incomes amongst our people is going to be a deterrent to sustain growth, because it tends to lead to spasmodic growth patterns. So remember in 91, 92, right after we came out of the power crisis, the Philippines was the new tiger cub. But after a few years, the growth petered out, right? So we have to be mindful of that. And now we're experiencing a bit of a power issue.
Yeah, okay. Let's move on to power, since you've stressed it. There wasn't much growth in manufacturing and agriculture, although we did experience a bit of a rise in 2013. Power in the Philippines is the most expensive so far in the region. Manny, do you see this as a major deterrent in terms of foreign direct investments? Frankly, you have other countries like Indonesia that's subsidizing power.
That's correct. I think you mentioned that FDI levels in the Philippines is actually quite low compared to our ASEAN neighbors. No? For the past 3 years, the level has been around 6 billion US. The next after us is Vietnam with about 23, and the highest is Indonesia with about 50 billion for the past 3 years. So I think the market factors in the constraints that they see in relation to the good performance of the government for the past 3 years. No? And power will be constrained in terms of not only the cost, as you said, it's not subsidized at all. It's a fully priced electricity market in this country. And I think we have to be mindful that we do import at least 50% of our fuel source, mainly coal. No? So to the extent that that is priced in accordance with, say, crude oil, then you're at the mercy of crude oil prices.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
if you could find indigenous supply of fuel source, mainly out of this country, then I think it will help. No?
Okay, now manufacturing seems to be the most important among the ASEAN countries in terms of making an economy, the numbers more sustainable. But in the Philippines, you have BPOs, it's more of a service sector economy, and OFW remittances. Convergys has 50,000 people in the country. We are known as a BPO economy, and while we celebrate it here in the country, some critics say it's not sustainable enough to actually take us to the next century.
Karen, as a matter of fact, I would want to tell you that there is one particular business sector in the country that has been experiencing exponential growth and sustainable growth. The information technology business process management industry is being fueled by enhanced and new investments from large and mid-sized foreign providers, as well as expansions from the established locators like Convergys, as well as captives that are located in many of the country's delivery locations. You know, the growth has been staggering and aggressive, and this traction is really a result of the focus that has been given by both the industry and its stakeholders, which includes the government, the academe, the business sector, in areas like human capital development, increased infrastructure actions and activities, alleviation of poverty through some of the government programs, focus on a number of educational programs, as well as aggressive marketing and advertising campaigns. You know, this industry last year generated $15.5 billion of revenue for the coffers of the Philippines and employed 900,000 Filipinos. But at the end of this year, we are looking at $18 billion of revenue, as well as employment for 1,040,000 Filipinos. With the cooperation of the different stakeholders to this industry, by 2016, we're looking at $25 billion of revenue and employment for 1,300,000 Filipinos directly, as well as direct employment for 3,200,000 Filipinos.
Now, clearly the edge of the country is you have an English-speaking nation compared to our Asian neighbors. I mean, Filipinos almost have an American accent without even trying. So they're easy to listen to on the phone, frankly. But I've heard some comments wherein, how do you move the BPO sector? How do you expand it that it goes to related businesses?
Right.
Are we in the higher end of that sector already?
Definitely a lot of movements are happening in the other dimensions of IT BPM. For example, last year, the most improved category is game development. It has increased from 3,000 presence or footprint in the country to about 4,000, which is sizable, something like a 25% increase. Definitely the voice outsourcing business is just burgeoning. It has been experiencing an average of 30% growth year on year during the last 10 years, for example. By the way, Karen, thank you for promoting me. I'm not chairman of Convergys Corporation, so our shareholders would be surprised. I'm chairman of Convergys Philippines, and Convergys, by the way, is not just the largest BPO, but the largest private employer in the country. That growth is truly exponential, and thanks to the quality of talent that we have in this country.
Secretary Jimenez, human capital seems to be, and it is, the strength of the country. Yes. Now, in terms of tourism, human capital is the direct edge. But some have felt that the Philippines has not really invested enough when it comes to infrastructure for tourism.
Well, you know, the fact remains, Karen, that nobody really invests anymore ahead of the demand.
But is that so? I'd like to debate. China does.
Whether they will be successful in that remains to be seen. But the fact of the matter is, generally, people want to see the whites of your eyes before they actually make an investment now. But if I may, you know, there's a lot of talk about miracles, and usually I take a bit of an exception to the use of the word because it tends to imply that something happened that is unexplained. I think people refer to the Philippine miracle only because something happened when they weren't looking. And now, but there is a perfectly good explanation for it. And in fact, when you think about the sustainability of growth, what you actually mean in today's paradigm, I agree with what Kevin was saying, but in today's paradigm, what must be sustainable is the sustainability of reform. That is the only guarantee that growth is going to be sustained. And that is fundamentally what happened in the Philippines. The logical explanation is there was a restoration of faith in the leadership. Consequently, there followed a restoration of faith in the system. And what we're seeing today is a restoration of faith in the future. When you go back to people, it only means that people, the Filipino people, have begun to believe more in themselves. And that's not exactly new. When people ask me about foreign direct investments, my response is always, the Filipino workforce is probably the most direct form of investment in the world. So when you think about it, and you take place out of it, and you just think of people, we are the most successful foreign direct investment in people for the BPO industry, for the medical care industry, for the maritime industry, for the hospitality industry, and so many other industries. When you think about it, the Filipino is probably one of the biggest foreign direct investment recipients in the world. The Philippines is simply the source. And we're very happy, in fact, that the source is now the focus of a lot of attention.
Okay, but I was gonna take a point you said of the Philippines being the biggest source of foreign direct investments. Vietnam, for example, has been very phenomenal in the last year. And manufacturing and agriculture in Vietnam has grown. You have a $3,000 GDP per capita. I want to ask you, Sherry, the words of inclusive growth, 7.2%. You work with farmers. Do you really feel it on the ground?
As the youngest in the group, I think, Karen, I would like to say that, we cannot really feel it, especially from the farmers level. That's why we need to wake up Filipinos, because this is our time. The youth are getting more proactive. The youth are getting more innovative.
But you don't feel any of the reforms that's been put in place by the government?
I really couldn't feel it on the farmers level because I really work with them. It's so hard to feel how 7.2% is mainstreaming into the grassroots. So I think in the Philippines, we hit rock bottom and there's no way but up. We just need to build a platform of solidarity that everyone must create wealth in this country, but we need to make sure that once we create wealth, we don't leave people behind us. So right now, a lot of youth are getting more proactive in terms of social entrepreneurship, left and right. It's so fabulous to be a social entrepreneur, things like that. There's a lot of innovation ongoing, but most of the time, they forget about inclusion, which is very, very important.
All right. Karim, Kevin, talk about inclusion. Does this really factor in the long run?
Well, I think I have to come back to the Secretary's point, and I really believe that this is absolutely fundamental in what's happened in the Philippines, restoration. I think totally right. This goes leadership, system, president. Now also, and I think this is a problem that is very big in Southeast Asia, bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Civil servants are there to make life difficult, not just for foreign businessmen, but also for local. Sorry, I think that's the truth. Yeah. And I think what often happens is that the larger businessmen, they can build a kind of infrastructure to deal with civil servants, but it's really the small businessman. And leaders such as President Aquino and some of the candidates in Indonesia now running for the presidency are very keen on, the fact is, reforming the bureaucracy benefits the small man. The guy who sells vegetables in the market is a entrepreneur, and he needs his life to be made easier. So if there's any permissions or izins, they call it in Indonesia, whatever, they should be easier to get. It's the small man who benefits from the reform of the bureaucracy, and that is critical. And as their energies are released, the economy will grow faster, and the inclusion that you are craving for will trickle down more. So you don't, the reform of the bureaucracy isn't just for the super huge investors. It's the importance is right on the ground.
Yeah.
At the village, the desa, and the barangay, what they call it.
Yeah. And Kevin, did you want to say something?
Sure. I think the way
In terms of the ease of doing business, I think it's a major factor in putting the country forward.
It's a major factor. If you look at the World Bank's Doing Business report, I think Philippines has improved dramatically from 2013 to 2014. I forgot the exact number. It's something like 35 ranking increase. But still, Philippines is sort of in the middle of the pack if you look at the countries globally. But I guess the point I want to make here is that this sort of ease of doing business reforms, these are almost an underlying driver for other economic drivers, right? You want sustained growth. The sustained growth has to be driven by certain sectors, but these sectors, you have to have underlying factors, such as the reform, such as the efficiency, such as infrastructure. I think people have talked about infrastructure several times. Let me just maybe spend one more minute on that. I think infrastructure is so important. That's why I don't think it's a driver. It's a driver of other drivers, right? It's underlying everything else, right? If you look at, it's not only about the growth driver, it's also about the competitiveness of the industries. If you have good infrastructure, many other industries become more competitive. I mean, a simple number would be, for example, at the World Bank, we say the cost of delivered food, right? Actually, around 40 to 60% is the cost of transport. It's not the cost of the food itself, right? So it's about the growth, it's about the competitiveness of those industries. It's about, frankly, also people's quality of life. Can you get around easily? Can you get energy? It's also about the job opportunities, right? When you do infrastructure, not only in the short term you create jobs, but in the long run, maintenance of roads, for example, and other sectors. So I really want to emphasize the importance of infrastructure as an underlying driver of all the other growth drivers, in addition to the reform and efficiency and ease of doing business.
All right. Later on, I'll ask Bill Luz about just how much the government is doing with infrastructure. That's later on, Bill. But in the ease of doing business, I think Manny, Cherry, and Marife, you could talk about this, and I'll have Secretary Mont to react. To put up a power plant in the Philippines, you need 165 signatures and a waiting period of 4 years. Considering you have a power problem, and you're doing business in Vietnam, Manny, and I want you to be very open. Is it easier to do business in other countries compared to your own country?
Well, we bought a 600 megawatt gas-fired plant in Singapore. It took us from soup to nuts about 5 months to do it.
5 months?
Yes.
Yeah, 5 months, okay.
We have planned on building a 600 megawatt coal-fired plant in Subic, and that has been on the burner since 2010.
So 6 years, not really, 4. 4.
Give or take. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
All right, let's talk about that, Manny. I think this is very informative. I mean, you've seen the Philippines going up in ranks, 100 to
Yeah.
now number 100 to
Yeah.
189.
Karen,
In
it
Asia,
goes-
6 to 10.
yeah, it goes to the point that certainly the soft part of development is important. Reforms, governance, and perception of the Philippines improving, right? But it must, there are the hard parts of development as well, because it can't be all perception. Like, for example, you're a CEO, right? And Marife has very good image and so forth and so on. But then your shareholders will ask you at the end of each year, where are the profits? Right? Where are the profits? And the main reason, I believe, that's why your inclusive growth is not as inclusive as it should be, because we're mainly a consumption-driven economy. And it's time to switch that to an investment-driven economy. That's what this FDI is very important, right? And Secretary Jimenez has paid tribute to the Filipino worker. Absolutely correct. I mean,
Yeah.
the overseas remittances are probably in the order of 25 billion. And your BPO's call centers, which is a proxy to overseas deployment of our people, is another 15. 40 billion US. It's the single largest and most successful industry of this country. That's our people. And the sweet spot of economic development is, right now, per capita is $3,000. if you could move it to $5,000, then I think the consumers will move towards the consumables to durable goods, and that's where your manufacturing industries could kick in. At the moment, to promote inclusive growth, we need emphasis on agriculture and the services industries like tourism. Of course, there are prerequisites to those things, like infra for people to get directly into, say, Mactan or Boracay, right? We need those. The hard parts of development must be addressed as well.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
just perception, diba?
Okay, I'll move to that later, but Karim's point on the ease of doing business is very interesting. What would you suggest? What kind of changes would you want to see? Clearly, the present government, the Aquino administration, has made major reforms, but it may not be enough. Give me some specifics that you'd want to see so business is much easier. Yeah. Don't worry, it's a world. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, edgy. You have to be edgy.
I told Karen, can I take off my shirt?
Yeah. It's the World Economic Forum.
Yes.
So yes. So
There are only
I
6 million
think-
people listening.
yeah.
I think at the end of the day, you have to define your overarching ideology.
Okay.
If our role, both business and government, is principally to promote the economic welfare of our people, then that defines the entire, and informs the entire program of government, doesn't it? Because at the end, it's the programs, all of the PPP projects are, for example, commendable, bar none. So I think we just get on with it, right?
Okay. Secretary, you may want to respond to this. I mean, clearly with the ease of doing business, and I'll ask Bill later on.
Yes, well, again, I think all points, especially when they're directed at speeding up, the hard, the hard infrastructure, all points are very well taken. The perspective that I would add, which is very important, and I do not raise this as an excuse, just as a reality that people have to acknowledge, is the Philippines is a very real democracy. And very often there is a tremendous temptation to dispense with what would be a sustainable democratic way of doing things and start to run roughshod over local government prerogatives, etc. Now, I come from an industry.
But does democratic have to mean long?
The answer, of
I mean,
course,
does it have to mean that? Like, I mean, something specific, the airport. Everybody went through the airport. I mean-
democratic means that the people must agree to it. Okay? And like I said, I come from an industry, tourism, where nothing is possible unless the local governments are activist about it first. I cannot step in and actually dictate what their tourism plans will be. I take their plans and I allow the world to see it in its best light. And as much as possible, I try to facilitate the success of that plan. But it is their plan, not mine. And believe me, that will take, and forevermore, that will probably take a little more time than it takes in places where you don't have to do that. And the Philippines has embraced that and accepted it as part of life in a democratic space.
Yeah.
Now, can it be done faster? Absolutely. I used to come from the advertising community where we made decisions by the minute, by the hour. And I joined government where the decision process, we swung all the way to the
Yeah.
other side. I have lost my voice screaming over the procurement system more often than any other subject. But
Yes.
I do not give in to the temptation to throw the rule book away. I
Yeah.
just don't.
But this is what Manny was saying. The reality is that these are the hard decisions. They're not sexy, but they're the reforms that could be needed. Perception is sexy. It makes great headlines. But the unsexy, unheadlinable decisions are, you've cut signatures from 100 to 30. You've cut permits to 5 to 2. Karim, Kevin, please. And compare it to, I think, the best being right now, the most, I wouldn't want to say threatening, but in terms of competition is frankly Vietnam and Myanmar. When you have local businessmen, Filipino businessmen putting up businesses in Vietnam.
You know, Karen, I really think there's something we are a little bit missing, which I also want to push back a little bit on what Secretary said earlier, okay? You want us to be edgy,
Please,
right? And I think we talk about the hard infrastructure. I think we need that. We talk about some of the soft issues in terms of efficiency reforms. I really think countries like Philippines additionally need is some long-term vision. You know, what does the country stand for in the international marketplace, right? So Vietnam stands for something today. Right?
What does
If you
Vietnam
talk-
stand for?
I think Vietnam for the past number of years stands for low-cost labor, that they can get a bigger
Okay.
market share from China, from many other places.
That's Vietnam.
A skilled labor
Yeah.
force at relatively low cost, right? When you talk about Myanmar, there is an image in the foreign investors. That's where you have a wealth of natural resources, large population, strategically located between a number of other important economies. People can immediately come up with a few things, right? The Philippines, I think there are a couple of things people think of. I don't think that's a coherent story, right? So that's number one. But number two, related to that, I think there's also a vision, which is why I want to push back a little bit. I really think for example, the China model, right? You can argue for all the problems it has. It has certainly created a miracle in a sense in terms of getting 600 million people out of poverty, right? So that is not necessarily unnoticed, but it's certainly something of a very large scale. I don't think China could have done that without a very long-term vision and the risk-taking. Basically, government says, here's a blueprint for the next number of years, let's get on with it, and maybe we will be accused of building ghost towns and highways to nowhere or whatever, but let's see how it goes. I would say that bet has largely paid off for China. And I would argue, in a relative scale, China is probably here, Philippines probably here. In terms of that long-term planning and risk-taking on the government side, I would think, I'm not arguing Philippines should move to here, but I think Philippines should move to probably here from that end.
Okay, I think first point to make, and I totally agree with the Secretary, you don't throw out the rule book in terms
Yeah.
of democracy. Also, worth noting that two of the largest economies in the world, the British and the German, capitals thereof, London and Berlin, as I understand it, are both struggling with their own airport capacity. The British have not made a decision for like 15 or 20 years. Tempelhof has just been postponed again.
Yes.
So, you know, that's a critical problem in democracy. It is slow. And if the
Okay.
Europeans are slow, don't let's think that everyone else can be that much faster, okay? But the airport here is horrendous, yeah? Sorry. Hands up, everyone. It's horrible, yeah? Okay. I think the other thing then is also to remember that democracy is a means, not the end. Therefore, you have to get into the rule book and change the rules. And you have to use the political capital to do that, to make things faster, yeah? Your point on long-term vision, totally right, but then very tough if you can only have a president for 6 years and he can't do 2 terms. I think that's another case of the rule book. You should have 2 terms, but a 2-term limit. Indonesia is 2 terms. And generally, once you've won the first term, you will win the second, power of incumbency. So, and I think you do need 2 terms. 1 term is not enough. 12 years, you can talk long term. And that's where you need to go.
Okay, but
Yeah.
that's a hard rule book to change.
Well, I mean, you know, do
That's
you
like
want...
a constitutional change
Yeah, but do
completely.
you want to move forward? This is the kind of challenge that Mr. Pangilinan is talking about. It's the rule book you've got to tackle.
Yeah.
Democracy is the means to the end.
Okay,
It's
all
not
right.
the end in itself.
I'm going to simplify this question. What happens after President Aquino leaves office? I think that's the question on everyone's mind. I'll start with Sherry.
Well, I'm confused now. Because actually, I really agree with Kevin. The country needs a long-term vision. So that's why right now, I would represent the youth in this. We've been craving for this. What would be the vision of our country in 10 years, in 20 years? We don't know. And, but for me right now, in just putting perspective in the country, I've been traveling around. I enjoy the Philippines so much. I didn't want to get out of my country. But we need to discover that there's beauty in the countryside that we need to develop. You know, I would agree with
Develop means
convergence.
spend money.
Yeah, spend money, but in creating wealth in the countryside. Like, for example, Converges. You can really see their offices in Bacolod, in other provinces,
Yeah.
not just in Manila.
Yeah.
So imagine you decongest Manila, you promote reverse migration,
Yeah.
then just focus on Manila because traffic is horrible. Horrible.
And I'd like to
Imagine-
acknowledge Accenture is also
Yeah,
in the
Accenture
Philippines
is
with, I think,
also in the
35,000 people.
Yes, you can really see if these businesses would also focus in bringing their offices in rural places, like in provinces. We have 7,107 islands. So imagine if we bring the wealth in the countryside, we can promote reverse migration. But more than that, people will not go to big cities.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about, oh, you wanted to say something,
Now,
Marife, very
relative
quickly.
to ease of doing business.
Yeah, ease of doing
Karen,
business.
You know, let me cite one particular government entity that has helped the BPO industry in terms of responding to our clients at the most rapid time scale. You know, when our clients say, we want to do business with you tomorrow, that site in Bacolod or Davao or Cebu or Baguio or Laguna must be ready today or yesterday.
So what
You know,
agency
this
is this?
agency is the Philippine Economic Zone Authority.
PEZA.
Yes,
Okay.
PEZA. PEZA, as you know, regulates the entry of investors into the country via the economic zones. They handle end-to-end processing of registration,
Okay.
incentives, and the like. You know what? This is a one-stop, no-stop agency, no corruption agency. When I say no stop, you know, the people in PBO industries are 24/7 business.
Yeah. So-
I would call Ilia de Lima at 2 in the morning.
So
when
wait,
I
do
have-
you feel that it is maximized, PEZA is maximized in terms of for foreign direct investments, very quickly?
I think there's still room for improvement, and that would be in the area of scale,
Okay.
additional resources.
All right. I'm going to open questions coming from the audience. I'd like to start with Bill Luz. How do you do this, Ethan? Does he have a mic or do you stand up? The mic. Oh, he's, okay. All right, Bill Luz. Bill Luz is the head of the National Competitiveness Council, and I want him to give the government's perspective in terms of the reforms that this administration has been putting on, and even the hard reforms, I think, that's been talked about today.
Well, thank you, Karen. I work for the National Competitiveness Council as a co-chairman, representing the private sector. So my job is to give the private sector perspective on how we can improve processes and other things. So on ease of doing business, we've worked a lot in the unglamorous side of streamlining and simplifying rules and regulations at the national government level and at the local government level. As Secretary Jimenez mentioned, LGUs are very important. So we made some improvements there, and to Kevin's point, we took a 30-country jump last year in a global ease of doing business ranking of IFC and World Bank. So it was the largest jump globally, and it was by dint of hard work. So I completely agree with Secretary Jimenez that, you know, I hesitate to use the word miracle because I think it downgrades the efforts that people have put in to put, you know, to make the improvements. It takes hard work, and it's going to take sustainable, long-term hard work to keep it going, and we're determined, absolutely determined to do it. It's been, you know, people say the bureaucracy is your enemy, but in this case, we've turned to the bureaucracy and challenged them and used benchmarks to tell them what other countries are doing, and I think they've responded beautifully. To the point that we should promote areas outside, we have not only simplified LGU processes and cut the number of signatures and steps to get any simple business permit, but also we started collecting competitiveness data on cities and municipalities because we feel that we should be attracting investments outside. Last year we rated 285 cities and municipalities. This year we're going to rate 550. So now businessmen will have a basis for saying, where do I go? Outside of Manila, where do we go?
Okay,
So,
now, Bill,
this the type
what
of
is
thing
the
we do.
vision of the Aquino administration in terms of the ease of doing business? Where do you want to take this?
Well,
if
you
it
know-
takes 146 signatures for a power plant, what's the goal? Do you
Well-
want it down to 50?
We're analyzing it. They've asked me to take a look at it, and the first thing I did is I went to industry and I said, tell me, how long does it take? What are the processes? What are the pain points? And what are the recommendations? give me your recommendations where we can cut. Then we sit down with the government agencies, the Department of Energy, Department of Environment, local governments, because we cannot just dictate what those changes will be, but neither can we, expect an agency to suddenly, change and become so customer conscious. So our job at NCC is we get the people, the agencies together with businessmen, and we tell them, you got to be more customer friendly. And I think this is what we're seeing in terms of the way agencies are behaving now.
Okay, Manny, I want to ask you, do you agree with that? Do you see it yourself? You blinked.
Was the politically correct answer?
No, you don't have to.
I think at the end, it's a question of creating a nurturing environment for business to lead the development effort, or to be a co-partner of government in development effort. I mean, clearly, a business's objective is profits, but I think most of the business groups here realize that part and parcel of that mission of business is to promote society's welfare, right? We cannot divorce the issues of inclusion and poverty by simply focusing on profits. So we have to, there's got to be that nurturing situation, because take the case of Tampakan. That's a local government issue to begin with.
Yeah. Can you give
So-
them a briefer on, because we have foreigners in the audience?
Well, it's an open pit mine that I think Xstrata Glencore are trying to develop. It's a world-class mine, and initially there was resistance against the project because it's an open pit mine, so there are huge environmental issues that are created by it. But Xstrata is a world-renowned mining company, and there are open pit mines elsewhere in the globe. No? My only point is that if the Canadians can do it, the Australians can do it, South Africans can do it, what the Filipino cannot do it? I think I cannot accept that point, right?
Okay. Now, Maria Ressa, okay. Maria Ressa, head of Rappler.
The perception is that we've done really well. I mean, reality and perception, right? We've done well, but that's low-hanging fruit. And the feeling of many people now is that the real work of institution building, and you talked about the rule book, that real work really hasn't been addressed. In fact, it's been used as an excuse to not move forward faster. An example is the Haiyan, Typhoon Haiyan. It is an emergency, and yet leadership could push forward further on it. Are we doing the real nuts and bolts work of building from the ground up the institutions that need to maintain democracy?
Can I just comment, Karen, on this thing? I didn't mean
And the
to suggest
Secretary,
at
you
all
can answer. Yeah,
that
go
we
ahead.
should throw away the rule book.
Yes,
I mean, economies have thrived in a very democratic setting and under very tightly regulated environment. Like, for example, look at Hong Kong. The securities regulations are very tight. Singapore, the same thing. And recently, when we acquired a company in Australia, I was slapped on the wrist for saying something about the offer price that we offered initially. So business can adjust, and the rules have got to be enforced. And there is no contradiction between following the rules and a thriving economy.
Okay.
That's what we have to reconcile. I don't think we reconcile that in this country.
Okay, Secretary, I think you should take this from Maria and Manny.
Well, I think, first to Manny's point,
Are we doing the
that's very
nuts and
true.
bolts work?
Yes, we are. In fact, I think there are days when we get too into the nuts and bolts, and this is the perception that we're kind of slugging along. But I share with you, an encounter with a friend in Germany. I was exasperated over development, etc., and he looked at me and he said, "Mon, how old is the Philippine Republic?" And I said, well, it's actually under 70 years old, if you think about it. He said, the German Republic is over 400 years old, and we're still quarreling with each other. And in effect, his message was this: momentum building is at once a recognition of what Manny said. We've got to get our act together. We've got to move faster because there are people going hungry as we speak. But building momentum requires a certain validity of process. Otherwise, as we have seen in other parts of the world, you go back to square one. All this talk about progress is not measured in terms of the gleaming skyscrapers you have. The sustainability of your growth still goes back to whether you actually built valid, sustainable momentum. And we're going through that. When I was asked, I said the Philippines is going through, warts and all, what I would describe as the painfully aware stage.
I think a simple question would be, if President Aquino were no longer president, should a businessman fear that his contract will not be respected? That his contractor winning the bid, he'll end up in court.
In other words, your
But
question
are
is,
the institutions in place?
are the reforms,
permanent?
irreversible?
Yes.
Absolutely. If you ask the Filipino people, for example, would they accept a dictatorship tomorrow? Irreversible.
But not that reform.
No, they will not.
Not that reform.
No, this is the mistake, Karen. And this is my message, because I used to come from the private sector. Our tendency in the private sector is always to define progress in terms of a timeline that includes only our lifetime. When you join government, you realize you can't look at the world that way. You can't look at your country that way. And well, like I said, you know, it is valid to worry about all these things precisely because that's what makes it sustainable.
Okay, Wash CSIP, I believe, has a question. Right beside you, madam. Washington CSIP is it's a 25-year-old sitting there. Morning, sir.
I want
An
to
icon of the Philippines.
take quite a different viewpoint.
Okay.
I'm an Asian, and I want to speak to other Asians and other foreigners here. We must have confidence in a country, through good or bad. No? We've had bad political leadership until the last President Aquino, I think. But we have survived. No? The outsourcing industry was I started it in 1983, the first outsourcing company, now employing 800,000. So when foreigners ask me, how come foreign investment are so low? I said, it's not the dollars and cents, it's how many people do you employ. Tourism is nature here. I didn't know about tourism in Bohol until a German friend of mine told me about it, and I found out there were 200 Germans that married 200 attractive Filipinas.
I don't know if that's okay. I'm kidding.
And that's part of the tourism industry.
Okay, Wash.
Now, there are so many things that I
Yes.
see. I've done business in all the Southeast Asian countries
Yes,
and helped business companies everywhere.
yes.
So the Philippines is, the human resources is the key.
Okay, all right.
And
Did you want to ask, madam? Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. But before I go to my question, I'll just say that changing the rule book is actually doable. When Ramon del Rosario was finance secretary, they looked at the customs rule book
Okay,
and they restructured it and they cut down the number of signatures. And for that time, and they used evaluation of imports from port of origin.
yeah.
So yes, you can do the rule book within a democracy, but my question is really about inclusive growth.
Okay,
In the Philippines, for instance, in the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, where the attention is being focused, more than a third of your labor force are illiterate. In Southeast Asia, we have a huge number of illiterates.
Okay.
Myanmar, Laos, etc. We cannot be inclusive if we do not address this particular issue, and we're failing. The MDGs, for
Okay.
instance, the goal, we're failing in that.
yeah, I need a government official to answer that. You want to take this for Secretary very quickly? Or Bill, would you want to take? I mean, we did K-12. The Aquino government is spending much more on education, but apparently it's not enough. Do you want to take this, Bill, just very quickly before I move to the ASEAN integration?
Yeah, just on the matter of inclusive growth. You know, when we track global competitiveness reports, we track about 12 of them, and we're we've moved up on 10. But what's important is we track those because they're the diagnostic tools for us to say, what do we need to fix in the country? And if we take a look at that now, education we spotted early on was a weakness.
Okay.
There's been a great deal of investment in public education, change in policy from kindergarten to K to 12, tertiary education. And I think in inclusive growth, we're beginning to see the impact of these growth rates. I mean, everyone's sounding negative here, but poverty dropped last year, and among the poorest of the poor, it dropped about 7%.
Okay.
Now, we need to continue to sustain that. So we're beginning to see some impact already from all this growth and all these reforms. And this is really just a question, I think, as Mon said, the restoration of faith in leadership and governance has been the key driver
Yes.
behind building up this confidence.
Yes, I think there's no doubt that the president's good governance equals good economics works. I think the question now is it enough to take us to the whole other level? Now we'll talk about the ASEAN integration as we reach the latter parts already of this session. In 2015, we are facing the ASEAN integration. It could be an opportunity, but it could also be a big challenge for the Philippines. An ASEAN integration would mean that a country would have to specialize on one specific area. Some foreigners I've spoken to have said, the Philippines doesn't come to mind first. For example, in the ASEAN integration, the Philippines being an archipelago, they've said, is already a minus. The sub-Mekong region, that would mean Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, are all connected by a stretch of land. So the Philippines is 100 million people, but take the sub-Mekong region, it is 650 million. And this is the competition, frankly, not just in this lifetime, next year. It is next year. So is the Philippines set up for the ASEAN integration? Because clearly all our Asian neighbors are geared up for the battle for 2015. Secretary Mon, then I'll move around the table. Are we ready for the ASEAN integration?
We will be, yes, we are. I'll give
Is
you an
it we
example.
will be or yes we are? You have to choose. Is it we will be or yes we are?
This is how fast we go.
Yeah, okay. All right. We will be, yes we are. I'm beginning.
Let's just talk about aviation. I say this a
Yeah.
lot. The Philippines is not part of a contiguous landmass, so we don't count land arrivals. When you say tourism in the Philippines, you actually mean 98.8% of the tourists arrive by air.
Yeah.
But even just a cursory inspection of the map tells you no one in this room traveled more than 7 hours to get here.
I'm not
The
sure about
Philippines
that.
is, well, except for those who came from
Yes,
Europe. But
yes.
if you're talking about Asia,
Okay.
we are right smack in the middle of everything.
So that's tourism.
You draw a 4-hour circle around the Philippines, you have a fairly good idea of what our opportunities will be for integration.
Okay.
Therefore,
So it's
we are,
tourism,
we are
tourism.
also going to be a beneficiary of a single ASEAN visa
Okay.
concept and open skies.
Yeah.
We will be. And we're used to sending workers abroad. In fact, our approach, as Marife knows, is there's more where it came from.
But is that even good in the long run to depend on that? I mean, you have brain drain, there's a cost to there's a social, cultural cost.
Your people are
to
your best
families.
investment. And yes, you have to believe that they are going to be your strength in the short and in the long haul.
All right. Karim, can you comment on, and Kevin, and I'll go through the table, on the sub-Mekong region, frankly. I mean, Secretary talked about the specializing specifically, let's say, in tourism, even if it's an archipelago, but putting up businesses, for example, you put up a factory in Vietnam, low cost, and then just take it by land, you already hit a whole other country.
Yeah, but I think Wash's point is most important. It's about confidence.
Okay.
It is about confidence of investing in the human resource here. Philippines has an enormous advantage with English, with this long-term investment. And as everything gets better here, the environment, you will find more and more Filipinos will be working back in the Philippines, servicing abroad. And that is what is inevitably happening. You know, I've been coming to Philippines 20 years. The amount of people now who have got a foothold in the middle class because of BPO is so enormous. They can buy apartments, little cars. Their lives have transformed. That did not exist. And in the past, all those people would have had to gone abroad. Now they live here. So I think it takes time. But this is my concern politically, when you can only have a president for one term, and then you have a change, and literally, do you have the same vision going forward, the same ethical viewpoints on things? That's my question.
Yeah, is this the fear of a foreign investor?
Not fear, I think it's a concern. Fear has gone. Fear is something dramatic, but concern is different. Yeah? Concern goes to issues of probity, issues of efficiency. Fear is like a total lockdown. When you say dictatorship, that's gone. It's concerns.
Okay, all right, Kevin. The Sub-Mekong region, ASEAN integration in 2015.
I think generally regional and sub-regional integration is not a zero-sum game. So you use the word battle. I think that's in a good sense. You want to compete for certain things, but I don't think it's a battle for a defined size of a pie, right? So I think that's my first point. And my second point is, as Secretary mentioned, there are a number of great strengths of this country, right? I think the location is actually very, very good. English speaking, you have great nature, great beaches. The key then is in that process of integration, can you make the best use of those? And that does take vision, as I mentioned, on the government side. And that also does take the government to be flexible, to let private sector to come with their vision if they have one. But my last point here is beyond this region I think the bigger question here is when you talk about growth drivers, right? We talk about investment versus consumer domestically. I think in my mind, the other big question is you have other much bigger economies in this region, whether it's Japan, whether it's China, whether it's India. How does Philippines position itself to benefit from the growth elsewhere, right? Because India's and China's will grow in the next many years. How do this country, a much smaller country from an economic size perspective, try to position itself to benefit from those growths beyond this immediate neighborhood?
Manny, I think you should take this. How should the Philippines benefit from the growth of other bigger nations?
Still a mystery to me. You mean out of the ASEAN integration?
Yes, yes. I mean, he's got a good point. You have Japan, China, India, and they will grow.
Well,
so
they
how
are
can we
trading
benefit?
partners. I think we're talking about the ASEAN integration, am I correct? Which will happen by the end of 2015.
Yeah.
It's always been a mystery to me. It's an elegant, seductive concept, but if you translate it into the particulars, what does it really mean? Does that mean mobility of labor? Don't think so. Can we export our doctors or nurses? Maybe, but I'm sure the host country will require accreditation. So it's, Mr. Secretary,
you feel
open
it
skies.
won't-
Won't the domestic carriers oppose an absolutely open skies policy? It will take time, I think.
Okay, so do you feel, Manny, that, Malaysia's always been very conservative with any liberal agreements. Do you feel that it won't benefit the Philippines as much?
Well, take sugar. Our sugar industry has been flattish in terms of production, at 2.2 million tons, raw sugar equivalent. We're not competitive against Thailand, whose cost of production is lower because they have bigger mills and their productivity at the farm level is much higher than ours. So does that mean if you push the theory comparative advantage, does that mean the Philippines should get out of the sugar business? Or what happens to the sugar farmers? So how does the industry respond to an open market where tariffs have dropped from around 18% to around 4%? Do we import our sugar?
Yeah.
So will that not stifle the growth of the sugar industry? Are we getting out of the industry? If you look at it from a pure agriculture standpoint, we only have one crop that produces export revenues of more than $1 billion, and that's coconuts. Thailand has got 6. Vietnam has got 5. So does that mean you close down your coffee plantations, your fisheries industries?
These
That's
are
a
the
tough
same
one.
concerns.
These are very good, very good.
That do you find in Indonesia, for example?
Yeah.
People are saying, well, what's in it for us? To be frank, the biggest beneficiaries of ASEAN Economic Community are the smaller economies, Singapore, Malaysia, and to a degree Thailand, which are more saturated.
Yeah.
And their businessmen are all looking Indonesia and the Philippines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that point, there's a
Yeah.
challenge.
That's a good one. Just throw in and then Sherry.
Just use open skies. When Pocket Open Skies was finally instituted in 2011, there were a lot of misgivings, particularly from the local airlines. Now they're making money hand over fist. And ultimately, when, at least the experience has been, when our corporations, when our people are put in a decidedly more competitive environment, they actually do better.
Okay.
This is what I
Yeah.
talk about, a restoration of institutions and trust in self. The initial resistance was simply a crisis of confidence. It wasn't because they couldn't do it. Now they're ordering new airplanes, they're planning new routes.
Okay, good point. Cherry, you wanted to react to Manny.
Yeah, I totally agree with Manny, what he said. Because in the Philippines, in terms of agriculture, in my personal perspective, we're not yet ready.
For ASEAN integration, you
for
mean?
ASEAN integration.
Yeah.
Because, for example, in rice production alone in the Philippines, how can we compete? Our rice here is 40 pesos per kilo. When you go to Cambodia and in India, they're only like 10 to 15 pesos.
Yeah,
per
you
kilo
should say that in
maximum,
English.
20
40 pesos would be like $1.
Yeah, $1
Per kilo.
Yeah, $1 per kilo.
Yeah.
But then when you go to India and Cambodia,
It's
they
like-
have like half $1 per kilo. So how can we compete? Do we need to tell our rice farmers to stop farming? Okay, so how can we now work backwards in
Okay.
terms of really, since of course you have human resources, our greatest wealth,
Yeah.
but I do believe that you have 12 million hectares of underproductive land in the Philippines that we need to
And-
develop.
And
Yeah.
Karen, if I may add,
Yes,
the
yes,
sad
no.
irony is that when you speak about inclusive growth, there are two obvious industries that provide immediate employment. One is agriculture, where 70% of the poor are located, and number two is tourism, the services industry, where
Yeah.
the Filipinos are good at. So let's focus on those things first.
Yeah, but no-
Manufacturing, tell me which industry.
Very interesting.
Tell
Now,
me.
tourism, moving on to tourism very quickly. Is that 5 minutes or 10 minutes? I can't tell. Okay, so moving on to tourism very quickly. The tourism is what many call now as the soft power. There are countries that survive on tourism. You have Spain, for instance, at one point was practically living off tourism. I want to ask you, Secretary Mon, I know we've had better numbers of tourists coming in, but has the country and has the Aquino administration really maximized its tourism potential?
No,
Have
we have
we
not.
really put a priority
We've-
on tourism?
I think it's fair to say we've only just begun. But we had a lot of, shall we say, housekeeping to do before we really got to speed. And like I said, it is inclusive almost by definition. I always tell people, you want to know how inclusive tourism is? I'll give you a few nouns: mountaintops, caves, underwater, isolated islands. These are not traditional areas of growth. And yet, you have jobs where jobs did not exist before. Here's a new job that never existed before: underground river boatman. There was no such
Yes.
job. And you are actually, I exaggerate only slightly, it creates opportunities precisely because it is defined around a market that's still discovering things now. But we acknowledge that there is a whole lot of infrastructure, a whole lot of issues on connectivity that
Yeah.
we have to settle. But like I said, if this republic went through life announcing that it wasn't ready, we wouldn't be here today.
Okay, mentioning connectivity very quickly before I go into foreign ownership. Manny Pangilinan, of course, is the chairman of the Philippine Long Distance Company, one of the biggest also cellular phone companies in the Philippines, Smart. Connectivity has been an issue. I mean, for many foreigners, tourists, you go to South Korea, it's practically Wi-Fi country. And frankly, the cost of doing business, if connectivity were very good, would be much cheaper. Sometimes it takes an hour, 5 hours to download or send heavy material from, let's say, a client abroad. What does the government need to do in terms of connectivity infrastructure? Has the government played its part?
Well, speaking of Korea, the government of Korea decided that, for example, in the matter of education, that in the after 5 years, there will be no more textbooks. So they're educating their people to use the laptops, the
Okay.
tablets, etc.
So that's vision.
That's vision. But they built the fiber optic, the backbone, within Korea. So the government spent the money and the private sector spent the connectivities, the access or the last mile. No? So it was a cooperation between the government and the private sector to wire up effectively Korea on a broadband basis. Here, it's the private sector that's doing that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there are constraints in terms of the size of the two major telcos in this country. But I think we made much progress in terms of connectivity in this country. We now, I think, both.
But should government play a bigger role? Should it invest more money, frankly, in connectivity?
I think it tried in the last dispensation, right? This, I think where we are situated is better, I think, for the private sector to do it.
Okay, all right. Now let's talk about the limitations, the restrictions on foreign ownership. There are a lot of foreigners in the audience, and foreigners still cannot own land in the Philippines in terms of doing business. Regulated industries, they're completely hands-off. I want to ask the foreigners here, Karim, is this a factor? How does Thailand do it? How did Malaysia do it?
Actually, land ownership is something which is very tightly controlled in Southeast Asia. I think only Malaysia allows freehold land to be owned by foreigners, yeah. So, frankly, the emotional attachment about land, very difficult to overcome. Secondly, I think, you know, perhaps because of '98 and the financial crisis sweeping across Asia, a lot of ownership rules were changed in many countries that were most impacted by that, Thailand and Indonesia to be exact. And now the countries and the leaderships are trying to reverse that. So, you know, you've got to prioritize at the end of the day your own people. You cannot just be listening to the consensus around you saying, sell everything, sell everything. I'm totally against that. You know, and I think, you know, I've got a lot of
Meaning
friends,
land, specifically land.
No, but why should you be forced to sell majority stakes in your banks? Because banks are a critical kind of channel of directing investments around the country. So I think you do need to manage that. As a government, as leaders, you've got to prioritize your own people, and sometimes you have to take these decisions. Agriculture, you've got to make your own mind up. And since you are elected in this country, you know about the needs. How can somebody with shareholders across the globe who would buy and sell the shares every 5 minutes possibly have your interests of your farmers, your workers at heart? You have to make that line.
I think you know what makes you interesting? You're not a complete liberal.
No, of course
No.
not.
All right, Kevin.
Yeah, on that point, I completely agree.
Really?
I
Okay, go on.
completely agree. I have no more comment on that.
What about businesses? I want to ask you, maybe Marife, you can take this on in terms of power, for example. Regulated businesses in the country.
Well,
Should we lift them
maybe
for
just going to
foreigners?
the point.
Yeah.
I think, you know, sometimes you get lost in the generality of the topic, right? If you look at the specific industries where foreign ownership of land can be, I think, quite easily addressed. For example, in agriculture, if you do engage in commercial farming, the best form is to lease the land. It's foreigners and even local investors would not want to buy 30,000, 100,000.
In Thailand itself, actually.
Yes,
Yeah.
even in
For
Malaysia,
100
as I
years,
understand
something
it,
like that.
Indonesia leases
Yeah.
its farmlands on a long-term basis because the money that the private investor puts in is in the development of the land for agriculture and the implements and the tools necessary to develop the land.
So do we need reforms in this area?
Not particularly, but the problem is that providing the access to land for a long-term lease, where is it? We've tried mightily, I think, to look at, right after Typhoon Pablo in Davao Oriental, the governor there invited Indofood to invest in agriculture. And we were quite keen to put up a palm oil plantation. But then it turns out that the land is owned by indigenous people, so we've had to deal with several tribes. And then it has to get approvals from the national government. So it became...
So there's a red tape issue. Okay.
Tough.
All right, Marife, do you want to add something very quickly?
Definitely. You know, next to labor, power would be the highest expense item of a BPO business.
Yeah.
And definitely if there is some assistance in that area, we will be able to address competitiveness. We will be
But power is not subsidized in the Philippines. It is in, I think, Indonesia, no, Bill? I mean, is that the way to go? Would you want power subsidized?
If the government can do it, why not?
Okay. Go ahead, Marife. But is this the way to go? I mean, in a free market economy, subsidizing doesn't really give you the real cost of doing business, too.
Well, if there are other channels to address the power issue, the Philippines being the most expensive in terms
Yeah.
of power rates, sure.
Okay. All right. We have 2 minutes to go, actually. And just to wrap up a bit, and I want to ask a closing statement from each of you. So some concerns that were brought up in terms of the Philippines is sustainability. Are the reforms going to stick way after President Aquino leaves office? Power is really a very big issue in terms of doing business. The ease of doing business, is it easier now in the Philippines? Has red tape been cut? This is also, it was brought up, you don't throw away the rule book, but you can make things easier. Is it conducive for business? So these are the issues that were brought up, and are we ready for the ASEAN integration? I'll have Kevin and Karim speak last. Closing statement, maybe the locals can do this. Is the Philippines the next Asian miracle?
Yes, we believe it is, and it is a perfectly explainable miracle, as I said. It's not a complete and total surprise to those of us who have to slog through the gains that you're seeing today.
Okay.
It started with the restoration of trust in leadership, and is now in full gallop, precisely because the people of the Philippines have regained their trust in the future and are putting themselves out there as a very active option for growth in this part of the world.
All right, Secretary Moni Menes, thank you for that. Marife, is the Philippines the next Asian miracle?
Definitely. As a matter of fact, I think the miracle is already happening. Where can you see a business that has grown to 55,000 in 10 years? Yeah. However, I echo what Mr. Washington Sisip said. We cannot leave everything to government. The private sector also has to lend a hand in all of these advocacies and initiatives that the government is taking. For example, to curb corruption, there is a private sector initiative called the Integrity Initiative that espouses ethical standards and kind of helps the government in curbing corruption.
Okay.
So again, let's not wait for government. I think the BPO industry was a collaborative effort between government, between the private sector, the academe, and business.
All right. Cherry, can the Philippines be the next Asian miracle given, you have stiff competition this 2015?
A resounding yes. I believe in my own country. I believe in our own people. And I think we can really do this. As long as we just need to work together, we just need to put our act together, we can do it, Karen.
Okay. Now the hard stuff, Manny, what does it take? Really, you're doing business all over Asia. What does it take to be, frankly, a resounding success after this?
Well, I believe that the Aquino administration has made great strides in the matter of certainly reforms, governance, and which translates into economic growth, no? An average about 7% for the past 3 or 4 years. And I would hope that that would continue because much remains to be done. Even in the matter of gender equality, where Filipino women are more equal than men, they've made great strides.
Agree?
Okay,
Agree.
that's the closing statement, sir. You don't want to be quoted saying it's an equality is the issue. That's it.
We got to have confidence in ourselves.
All right. Okay, unfortunately, as much as I want to hear from Karim and Kevin, we don't have enough time, and the session is quite strict. But I think our takeaway from this discussion is it's possible, but a lot of the hard decisions have to be made, and competition is going to be very tough come ASEAN integration in 2015. There are real problems and challenges, and frankly, the Philippines has to address that. And unless we change the constitution on a second term for the president, as Karim says, we have to make do with what we have today, and everything else is up to the country after that. Thank you very much for watching this session. And the ANC coverage of the World Economic Forum continues. There are more televised sessions throughout the day. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm Karen Davila.